Inside a Mitsubishi Heavy Industries office in Nagasaki, during the late morning of August 9th, 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was trying to explain that a single bomb had destroyed most of Hiroshima 3 days earlier. Then an intense white flash interrupted every certainty in the room. In an instant, the city itself became the next target of an atomic attack, and the young employee, speaking from first-hand experience, found himself facing a second catastrophe that few people could have imagined possible. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was 29 years old, employed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries as an engineer, draftsman, or technical employee, according to the wording supported by selected historical sources. Only 3 days earlier, he had returned from Hiroshima exhausted, physically injured, and still struggling to comprehend what he had witnessed there. Now, before he could fully describe the destruction he had already survived, another blinding flash transformed the moment into one of the most extraordinary civilian experiences ever documented during World War II. The available evidence indicates that this remarkable story cannot be understood through a single dramatic moment alone. It must be followed step by step. Why was Yamaguchi working in Hiroshima only days before the war reached its devastating conclusion? How did he escape a city that seemed almost impossible to leave? Why did he return to work so quickly despite his condition? What protected him during the second atomic bombing in Nagasaki? How did his wife Hisako and their infant son survive those dangerous days? And why would the Japanese government decades later officially recognize him as having been directly exposed in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while historians also acknowledge that other individuals experienced both bombings? Even these questions require careful historical treatment. Surviving testimony describes many details of Yamaguchi's experience, but accounts differ regarding his exact position inside the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki, the precise protective structure that reduced his exposure, the exact sequence of his movements immediately after the flash, and some quotations later attributed to him. Throughout this documentary, established historical evidence will remain separate from later recollections whenever the surviving record leaves uncertainty. To understand how one civilian came to stand inside two cities struck by atomic weapons only 72 hours apart, the story must first return to the final months of the Pacific War. By the summer of 1945, Japan's strategic position had deteriorated dramatically after years of exhausting conflict across the Pacific. Allied naval power had isolated much of the Japanese home islands. Conventional bombing campaigns had already destroyed large sections of numerous cities, and military leaders on every side confronted decisions whose consequences would reshape modern history. In the United States, the Manhattan Project had completed development of an entirely new class of weapon after years of secret scientific and industrial work. American civilian and military leaders debated how those weapons might be used while broader plans continued for strategic bombing, possible invasion operations against Japan, and efforts to compel surrender before even greater loss of life could occur. Within that evolving military picture, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became possible atomic targets for different strategic and operational reasons supported by historical documentation rather than by coincidence alone. None of the civilians living or working inside those cities could fully understand how quickly their ordinary routines would become part of world history. Among them was a young Mitsubishi employee whose business assignment, return journey, family responsibilities, and extraordinary survival would eventually become one of the most carefully examined civilian stories of the atomic age, not because history selected him through destiny, but because reliable evidence preserve an experience that continues to illuminate the human reality behind one of the defining moments of the 20th century. As the stunned silence inside the Mitsubishi office gave way to confusion, the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi reached back beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki to decisions made months earlier by governments, scientists, military planners, and industrial workers whose paths would eventually intersect in ways none of them could fully foresee. By the spring and summer of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final and most destructive phase. Japanese forces had suffered repeated defeats across the Pacific Allied naval power had isolated much of the Japanese home islands, and an extensive strategic bombing campaign had already damaged many cities through conventional air attacks. Even so, Japanese military resistance continued, and Allied leaders faced difficult choices as they considered how to end the war without prolonging a conflict that had already consumed millions of lives. At the same time, the secret Manhattan Project had reached its final stage after years of scientific research, engineering, and industrial production spread across multiple locations within the United States. On July 16, 1945, the Trinity test in the New Mexico desert successfully demonstrated the first nuclear explosion, confirming that an entirely new category of weapon had become operational. Shortly afterward, President Harry S. Truman attended the Potsdam Conference while his administration weighed military recommendations, diplomatic considerations, and the continuing expectation that Japan had not yet accepted unconditional surrender. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration called upon Japan to surrender or face what it described as prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government did not immediately accept those terms, and preparations already underway for the possible use of atomic weapons continued. The process that ultimately selected Hiroshima involved several military and operational considerations rather than a single factor. Historical documentation shows that Hiroshima contained important military headquarters, transportation connections, communications facilities, and industrial production supporting Japan's war effort. At the same time, it remained a large civilian city where families lived, children attended school, workers commuted each morning, and ordinary routines continued despite years of war. Any accurate historical account must recognize both realities together instead of reducing Hiroshima to either a purely military installation or solely a civilian community. While those strategic decisions unfolded far above the lives of ordinary people, Tsutomu Yamaguchi continued fulfilling responsibilities that had nothing to do with grand military planning. 29 years old and employed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Nagasaki as an engineer, draftsman, or technical employee, according to selected historical sources, he had traveled to Hiroshima on a temporary business assignment connected with shipbuilding work. Reliable accounts also place co-workers including Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyoshi Sato in Hiroshima during that assignment, although surviving records differ on some details of their movements and conversations. After completing the work that had brought them there, the men prepared to leave Hiroshima and return home. According to Yamaguchi's later recollections, however, he suddenly realized that he had left behind an important personal item, often described as his identification seal or personal hanko. Believing he needed to retrieve it before departing, he temporarily separated from his co-workers and changed the course of his morning without any awareness of the larger events already unfolding beyond the city. Nothing in the historical record suggests that American planners knew who Tsutomu Yamaguchi was, where he happened to be walking, or that any decision was connected to his individual presence. He remained one civilian among hundreds of thousands living and working in a city that had become part of a much broader military strategy. On the morning of August 6, 1945, as Yamaguchi moved through Hiroshima preparing to complete one final errand before returning to Nagasaki, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress Enola Gay approached the city carrying the uranium weapon later known as Little Boy, while below, everyday life continued for a few final moments before the world entered the age of nuclear warfare. At approximately 8:15 on the morning of August 6, 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was still thinking about an ordinary task. According to his later recollections, after separating from his co-workers to retrieve an important personal item before leaving Hiroshima, he noticed an aircraft high above the city and then observed what he believed were objects descending beneath it. Like many civilians below, he had no reason to suspect that the moments unfolding overhead marked the beginning of a completely new chapter in military history. His attention shifted upward only briefly before an intense, white flash overwhelmed the morning sky. Instinct rather than careful thought drove his next movement. Surviving testimony describes Yamaguchi throwing himself toward lower ground near an irrigation ditch or similar depression in the landscape, just as a powerful blast wave swept across the area. Within seconds, the familiar streets of Hiroshima disappeared beneath violent wind, flying debris, dust, and darkness that arrived in broad daylight. For several moments, the world around him no longer resembled the city he had been preparing to leave. The available historical evidence indicates that Yamaguchi survived the initial explosion but suffered injuries that later accounts describe in restrained terms, including burns, damaged hearing, temporary difficulty seeing clearly, and profound physical shock. Different publications have reported varying estimates of his distance from the point where the bomb exploded. Responsible historical accounts, therefore, describe his location cautiously as approximately 2 miles, or about 3 kilometers from the hypocenter, unless relying upon a source that establishes a more precise figure. At that moment, however, such measurements meant nothing to him. He did not know what kind of weapon had been used. He had no knowledge of radiation, uranium, nuclear fission, or the aircraft's mission. He did not know the weapon would later become known as Little Boy, nor could he possibly estimate casualties or understand the larger military significance of what had happened. He understood only that the familiar world had changed in an instant and that survival depended upon continuing to move. As the immediate shock gradually eased enough for him to stand and regain some awareness of his surroundings, Yamaguchi attempted to orient himself using whatever recognizable landmarks remained visible. Smoke, broken structures, drifting dust, and scattered debris made ordinary navigation extraordinarily difficult. Nevertheless, he began moving cautiously toward Mitsubishi facilities or another location connected with his work assignment, believing that familiar co-workers might also be searching for one another. According to surviving testimony, he eventually reunited with Akira Wanaga and Kuniyashi Sato, fellow Mitsubishi employees whose presence in Hiroshima during the assignment is supported by reliable historical accounts, although some details surrounding their exact movements continue to vary among different sources. Their reunion did not provide explanations for the disaster surrounding them. Like everyone else who had survived the first moments, they possessed only fragments of understanding gathered from personal observation. Communications across the city had largely collapsed. Organized information was scarce. Rumors spread more quickly than verified facts, and ordinary assumptions about air raids no longer seemed adequate to explain what they had witnessed. Throughout the afternoon, the sky remained altered by expanding smoke, suspended dust, and widespread destruction that reduced visibility across large sections of Hiroshima. Familiar streets became difficult to recognize, transportation ceased functioning normally, and every practical decision centered upon finding temporary safety rather than answers. As daylight gradually disappeared behind layers of smoke and debris, Tsutomu Yamaguchi understood only one immediate objective. He had to survive the coming night, remain with those he could find, and somehow discover a route that might still carry him out of Hiroshima and back toward Nagasaki. Even though no one around him could yet explain what had transformed an ordinary summer morning into an event unlike anything they had ever experienced. As the first afternoon after the atomic bombing unfolded, Tsutomu Yamaguchi and the co-workers who had survived with him faced problems far more immediate than understanding what kind of weapon had struck Hiroshima. Every familiar system that normally supported a modern city had begun to fail. Roads were blocked or damaged. Many bridges could no longer be relied upon. Communications had broken down across large areas, and organized emergency services struggled to respond under conditions unlike anything they had previously encountered. Hospitals and clinics that remained standing quickly became overwhelmed, while medical supplies, transportation, and reliable information were all in short supply. For those who had survived the initial explosion, the first priority was no longer completing business assignments or returning to ordinary routines. It was simply finding temporary shelter and remaining alive until morning. According to surviving testimony and historical accounts, Yamaguchi and other survivors, including co-workers where the evidence supports their presence, eventually found refuge in an air raid shelter or another temporary place of safety during the first night after the bombing. The shelter offered little certainty about what had happened beyond its walls. Rumors circulated constantly, but verified information remained scarce. No one inside could accurately estimate the number of casualties, explain the unfamiliar nature of the new weapon, or predict what the following day would bring. Throughout the night, uncertainty became as constant a companion as exhaustion. Yamaguchi continued coping with burns, damaged hearing, temporary difficulty seeing clearly, and the physical shock that followed the blast. Yet his thoughts increasingly turned away from Hiroshima itself and toward Nagasaki. His wife, Hisako, and their infant son remained there, unaware of whether he had survived the events of August 6th. With communications disrupted across much of western Japan, sending word home proved nearly impossible. He could only hope that they remained safe while searching for a practical route back to them. During the following day, surviving accounts describe gradual signs that portions of the transportation network were beginning to function again despite widespread destruction. Although Hiroshima had suffered catastrophic damage, some rail sections outside the most heavily affected areas remained usable, while surviving railway personnel restored limited service. On others with remarkable speed, news spread among survivors that westbound rail service was once again moving through portions of the region, creating a narrow opportunity for those able to travel. According to accounts that placed them together during this stage of the journey, Yamaguchi and his surviving colleagues, Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyashi Sato, made the difficult journey toward Hiroshima Station. Reaching the station itself was far from simple. Damaged streets, disrupted traffic, uncertain directions, and the general collapse of normal urban infrastructure turned even short distances into exhausting efforts. Yet the possibility of leaving the city outweighed every obstacle. When transportation finally became available, the journey westward reflected a nation still fully engaged in war rather than one already approaching peace. Trains carried large numbers of civilians, workers, military personnel, and other travelers, many of whom possessed only fragments of information about recent events. Delays remained common as damaged infrastructure continued to affect schedules and routes. Although many passengers understood that Hiroshima had suffered an unprecedented attack, there was no broad public understanding of radiation, its possible long-term effects, or the scientific principles behind the weapon that had caused such destruction. Yamaguchi himself knew only what his own eyes had witnessed. He possessed no reliable casualty figures, no knowledge of future medical consequences, and no awareness of the diplomatic and military decisions simultaneously unfolding in Washington and Tokyo. His world had narrowed to a single urgent objective: return home. According to the official and widely reported timeline preserved in historical records, Tsutomu Yamaguchi reached Nagasaki on August 8, 1945. Physically weakened, exhausted from the journey, and still recovering from the events in Hiroshima, he nevertheless remained determined to reunite with Hisako and their infant son, receive whatever medical treatment was available, and begin rebuilding the ordinary family life that the war had repeatedly threatened to take away. By the time Tsutomu Yamaguchi reached Nagasaki on August 8, 1945, the familiar streets of his hometown carried none of the visible destruction he had left behind in Hiroshima. Yet for him, the journey had not truly ended. He returned physically weakened, exhausted by travel, and still recovering from burns, damaged hearing, and the shock of surviving an event he could scarcely describe. His first priority was not work or military affairs, but home. According to reliable accounts, he reunited with his wife, Hisako, and their infant son, discovering with profound relief that they had survived the previous days unharmed. The uncertainty that had accompanied every mile of his journey from Hiroshima finally gave way to the reassurance that his family was still together. Available testimony also indicates that Yamaguchi received medical attention after returning to Nagasaki. His burns were cleaned and bandaged as well as circumstances allowed. Although wartime shortages and the pressures placed upon local medical services limited what treatment could be provided, he remained in considerable discomfort. But there was little expectation in Japan during the final months of the war that ordinary workers could simply withdraw indefinitely from their responsibilities unless absolutely necessary. Daily life continued under conditions shaped by military necessity, limited resources, and long-established social expectations regarding duty and perseverance. Those expectations help explain why, despite his condition, Yamaguchi prepared to report back to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries on the morning of August 9th. His temporary assignment in Hiroshima had officially concluded. Company procedures required employees to account for completed work, and wartime industry depended upon maintaining whatever continuity remained possible. The historical record does not establish that he returned because of any single personal motivation or dramatic sense of destiny. Rather, the available evidence suggests that reporting to his workplace reflected the practical obligations expected of employees serving Japan's wartime industrial economy in 1945. At the Mitsubishi office, Yamaguchi attempted to describe what he had experienced only 3 days earlier. According to later recollections, he explained that a single bomb had devastated most of Hiroshima. Those listening struggled to understand the scale of what he described. Conventional bombing raids had already become familiar throughout Japan, but the idea that one aircraft carrying one bomb could transform an entire city challenged every previous assumption about aerial warfare. Surviving accounts differ regarding the exact wording of the conversation, the identities of everyone present, and the precise office location where it occurred, yet they consistently describe the extraordinary difficulty of communicating an event that almost no one outside Hiroshima had personally witnessed. While Yamaguchi spoke from direct experience, events far beyond Nagasaki continued unfolding at the highest levels of government and military command. After the attack on Hiroshima, Japan's leadership remained divided over whether and how to surrender. No final decision had yet emerged. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched military operations in Manchuria, introducing another major strategic development that further transformed the political and military situation. At the same time, the United States prepared a second atomic mission. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress boxcar first approached Kokura Arsenal, the mission's primary target, but smoke and haze obscured the aiming point. With fuel becoming an increasing concern, the crew turned toward Nagasaki, the secondary target, carrying the plutonium weapon later known as Fat Man. None of those operational details, however, were known to Tsutomu Yamaguchi as he stood inside the Mitsubishi office. He did not know the aircraft's designation, the weapon's design, or the decisions that had redirected the mission toward his own city. He knew only what Hiroshima had taught him through painful experience. Then, at approximately 11:02 that morning, the room around him began to brighten with an unmistakable white flash. Before anyone else could fully comprehend what they were seeing, Yamaguchi recognized a terrifying pattern that his memory had already recorded only 3 days earlier. The second white flash arrived before anyone inside the Mitsubishi workplace could fully understand what was happening. Only 3 days earlier, Tsutomu Yamaguchi had watched Hiroshima disappear beneath an unfamiliar force unlike any conventional bombing raid he had previously experienced. Now, on the morning of August 9th, 1945, the same overwhelming light suddenly filled the room once again. According to Yamaguchi's later testimony, instinct immediately replaced conscious thought. Rather than standing frozen in confusion, he reacted as someone whose memory had already learned a terrible lesson. He attempted to take cover as quickly as circumstances allowed, seeking whatever protection the building could offer before the blast reached the workplace. Moments later, the shock wave struck. Windows shattered. Interior partitions failed. Dust and fragments filled the air, and the familiar office disappeared into darkness and confusion. Visibility collapsed almost instantly as suspended debris drifted through the damaged structure. For several moments, orientation became nearly impossible. Once again, Yamaguchi found himself struggling to understand whether he had survived another event beyond ordinary human experience. The available historical record describes his survival, but also advises caution regarding exactly how the building shielded him. Different accounts place him in slightly different locations within the Mitsubishi complex at the moment of the explosion. Some later descriptions refer to a reinforced wall. Others mention a stairwell or another substantial section of the structure, while additional accounts simply describe the protection provided by the office building itself. Because surviving testimony does not establish every architectural detail with complete certainty, the precise configuration of the shelter should be treated carefully rather than presented as settled fact. What the evidence consistently supports is that some combination of the building's structure, Yamaguchi's immediate reaction, and his position inside the workplace reduced the direct effects of the blast sufficiently for him to survive a second atomic bombing. As the dust slowly began to settle, another realization emerged with startling speed. Although no official explanation yet existed inside the building, Yamaguchi recognized a pattern that no one else around him had personally witnessed. The blinding flash, the overwhelming blast, the sudden collapse of ordinary surroundings, and the strange silence that followed all resembled the events he had endured in Hiroshima only 72 hours earlier. His co-workers could observe the destruction surrounding them, but they could not yet know that Nagasaki had just experienced a weapon similar to the one that had transformed Hiroshima. For Yamaguchi, however, the similarities were immediate enough to raise an almost unimaginable possibility before reliable information could confirm it. Once he was able to leave the damaged workplace, his priorities narrowed exactly as they had after the first bombing. Military questions, government decisions, and the identity of the attacking aircraft meant little beside a single urgent concern. Hisako and their infant son remained somewhere within Nagasaki. The city around him had again become difficult to navigate as damaged streets, disrupted transportation, and broken communications complicated every movement. According to surviving testimony, Yamaguchi began making his way through those damaged areas in search of his family, relying upon familiar routes wherever they remained passable. Historical accounts do not support dramatic rescue scenes or extraordinary feats beyond the movements he later described. Instead, they present the determined progress of a husband and father moving through uncertainty with little reliable information about those waiting at home. Later family testimony adds another detail that has appeared in numerous accounts. According to those recollections, Hisako had left home carrying their infant son while searching for ointment or medicine to help treat Yamaguchi's burns from Hiroshima. Because this detail comes primarily from later family accounts rather than contemporary documentation, it should be understood with appropriate caution. What the available evidence does consistently establish is that Yamaguchi eventually discovered that both Hisako and their child had survived. The relief of finding his immediate family alive did not end the crisis surrounding them. Nagasaki had now entered the same bewildering reality that Hiroshima had faced only days before, where communications had collapsed, ordinary life had been disrupted, and an invisible danger that few people yet understood remained present even after the blinding light had faded. During the days that followed the second atomic bombing, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's greatest challenge was no longer escaping a devastated city, but enduring the uncertain physical consequences that continued to unfold without clear explanation. According to his testimony and later historical accounts, the injuries he had carried home from Hiroshima did not simply disappear after reaching Nagasaki. Instead, his recovery became uneven and unpredictable. He experienced periods of fever, profound fatigue, and continuing discomfort from his burns. His damaged hearing remained a persistent reminder of the first explosion, while later accounts also described temporary hair loss and additional symptoms that have often been associated with radiation exposure. Because medical understanding and documentation varied considerably in the weeks immediately following the bombings, Responsible historical interpretation avoids assigning precise diagnoses or claiming that every symptom resulted from a single identifiable cause. The available evidence establishes that Yamaguchi became seriously ill during this period, but many aspects of his medical condition can only be described cautiously through surviving testimony and later recollections. Inside the family home, Hisako assumed responsibilities that extended far beyond ordinary household care. She looked after her recovering husband while also protecting and caring for their infant son under conditions shaped by wartime shortages and widespread uncertainty. Food remained difficult to obtain, medical supplies were limited, and reliable treatment was not always available. Like countless other Japanese families, they faced practical questions each day about shelter, nutrition, and the future while possessing almost no scientific understanding of what invisible dangers might remain after the explosions. Neither Yamaguchi nor those around him understood concepts that later generations would associate with radioactive fallout, long-term radiation exposure, or delayed health effects. Doctors, nurses, government officials, and survivors themselves confronted an entirely unfamiliar situation for which established medical knowledge offered few immediate answers. Every improvement brought cautious hope, while every setback raised new uncertainty. Yet daily life still demanded ordinary responsibilities, even as extraordinary events continued, shaping every decision. Beyond the walls of the Yamaguchi household, Japan itself approached a historic turning point. Military defeats accelerated across multiple fronts. Soviet operations continued after entering the war, and the combined impact of the atomic bombings transformed discussions within the Japanese leadership. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio, announcing Japan's acceptance of surrender. For many citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the announcement marked more than the formal conclusion of the Pacific War. It also represented the collapse of the wartime system that had sent him to Hiroshima on a temporary Mitsubishi Heavy Industries assignment, expected him to fulfill his responsibilities despite injury, and placed ordinary civilians within the machinery of a global conflict. Peace did not immediately restore health, erase uncertainty, or answer the questions created by two atomic bombings. The physical effects continued beyond the first weeks, and the emotional weight of remembering two devastated cities remained part of everyday life. As later testimony makes clear, survival itself did not mean that suffering had ended. Instead, his later testimony makes clear that although he had physically lived through two atomic attacks separated by only 3 days, their consequences accompanied him far beyond the summer of 1945. The memories, recurring health concerns, unanswered questions, and responsibility of explaining experiences that few others could fully comprehend became part of his life long after the explosions had faded into history. As Allied occupation began reshaping post-war Japan and ordinary routines slowly returned, Tsutomu Yamaguchi faced a new challenge unlike any military assignment he had previously known. He had to build an ordinary civilian future, support his family, continue working when possible, and carry one of the most extraordinary documented experiences of the 20th century largely in private for many years to come. Tsutomu Yamaguchi entered the post-war years carrying memories that few people around him could fully understand. Yet for a long time he did not seek public attention because of them. Like many hibakusha, he faced not only the physical consequences of the atomic bombings, but also the uncertainty surrounding illnesses that doctors and researchers were still struggling to understand. Medical examinations continued. Symptoms gradually changed over time, and the future often seemed impossible to predict with confidence. At the same time, Japan itself was undergoing profound transformation under Allied occupation. Industries were reorganized, cities were rebuilt, and millions of people attempted to create ordinary lives after years of conflict. Yamaguchi focused on responsibilities that could be measured one day at a time. Reliable biographies describe several occupations during the early post-war years, including work as a translator for occupation authorities, educational work, and later engineering-related employment with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, although the precise sequence is presented somewhat differently across published accounts. His marriage to Hisako continued through the difficult years of Reconstruction, and together they raised their children while navigating the practical realities that many Hibakusha experienced. Although public sympathy certainly existed, survivors also encountered misunderstanding, social stigma, employment concerns, and continuing uncertainty about possible long-term health effects. Much of that uncertainty reflected the limited scientific knowledge available during the early post-war decades. Questions surrounding radiation, exposure, future illness, and hereditary effects often remained unanswered for many years, leaving survivors to make personal decisions without the certainty later medical research would gradually provide. Throughout much of his adult life, Yamaguchi rarely placed his own experiences at the center of public discussion. According to reliable accounts, he instead processed many of those memories privately through writing, poetry, and personal reflection. His published memoirs and later creative work demonstrate an effort to preserve memory without transforming suffering into spectacle. Because many of his private thoughts remain undocumented, it would be inappropriate to attribute specific emotions or quote verses that are not supported by reliable sources. What the historical record does establish is that writing became one means through which he organized experiences that had shaped every stage of his adult life. As the decades passed, however, Yamaguchi increasingly moved from private reflection toward public testimony, using interviews and public appearances to communicate the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to later generations. He increasingly accepted interviews and opportunities to describe what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, emphasizing the human consequences of nuclear warfare rather than political accusation. This gradual transition eventually brought him into wider public awareness through the documentary Niju Hibaku, also known internationally as Twice Bombed, Twice Survived. In 2006, he traveled to New York in connection with a United Nations screening of that documentary, where he appealed for nuclear disarmament and encouraged world leaders to recognize the lasting human consequences of atomic weapons. His message did not suggest that surviving 2 atomic bombings meant escaping without lasting effects. On the contrary, his own life demonstrated that survival meant remaining alive through the explosions and everything that followed afterward, including years of physical recovery, medical uncertainty, emotional memory, and the responsibility of bearing witness. In 2009, Nagasaki authorities formally updated Yamaguchi's official survivor record to recognize direct exposure in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a decision whose precise historical meaning would later require careful explanation. By the final years of his life, the story that had remained largely private for decades had become something far greater than the account of one survivor. Through careful testimony grounded in lived experience, Tsutomu Yamaguchi transformed an extraordinary personal history into a lasting public warning about the consequences of nuclear weapons and the enduring value of remembering what they truly mean for humanity. In 2009, more than 60 years after the end of World War II, Tsutomu Yamaguchi received a form of recognition that reflected both careful historical documentation and the remarkable path his life had taken. Nagasaki authorities officially certified that he had been directly exposed to the atomic bombings in both Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. That decision did not create a story. It acknowledged a body of evidence that had been preserved through testimony, official records, and years of examination. At the same time, responsible historical scholarship requires an important distinction. Yamaguchi was not necessarily the only human being who experienced both atomic bombings. Historical research has identified other individuals who were present in Hiroshima before later reaching Nagasaki and surviving the second attack. What made Yamaguchi unique was that he became the first and only person officially recognized by the Japanese government as having been directly exposed in both cities. That difference matters because historical accuracy depends not only upon powerful stories, but also upon careful language. Expressions such as "the only man who survived both bombs" attract attention and capture the extraordinary nature of his experience. Yet, without qualification, they can unintentionally misrepresent the historical record. The available evidence securely establishes that Tsutomu Yamaguchi was present in Hiroshima on August 6th, returned to Nagasaki, experienced the second atomic bombing on August 9th, survived both events, later shared his testimony publicly, and received official recognition in 2009. The historical record cannot establish every step he took through each city, every exact location where he sought protection, the precise architectural feature that reduced the force of the blast, his exact radiation exposure, every private thought that entered his mind, or every possible alternative outcome that might have occurred under different circumstances. Those uncertainties do not weaken his story. Instead, they remind us that responsible history distinguishes documented evidence from understandable speculation. On January 4th, 2010, Tsutomu Yamaguchi died from stomach cancer at the age of 93. His passing marked the end of a life that had spanned one of the most consequential periods in modern history, yet did not end the influence of the testimony he chose to leave behind. His experiences continue to be preserved through recorded interviews, memoirs, poetry, family records, peace memorial institutions, museum collections, documentary films, and ongoing historical scholarship. Together, those sources allow later generations to examine not only what happened during the atomic bombings, but also how one survivor understood their lasting human consequences. Looking back across his life, no single explanation can account for why Tsutomu Yamaguchi survived while countless others did not. His survival resulted from a chain of circumstances that included wartime institutions, temporary business travel, geography, transportation that resumed despite enormous disruption, the protection offered by available structures, decisions made within moments of danger, the determination to return home, the support of his family, and opportunities that unfolded through chance rather than certainty. None of those elements alone explains the outcome, and together they should not be mistaken for destiny or personal invulnerability. Instead, they illustrate the profound vulnerability of ordinary civilians whose lives became intertwined with technological innovation, military strategy, and global war. Yamaguchi spent the remaining decades of his life transforming that experience into a message of memory and restraint. He did not argue that. Surviving 2 atomic bombings made him extraordinary in a heroic sense. Rather, his testimony consistently pointed toward a simpler conclusion. History preserved Tsutomu Yamaguchi not because he was invulnerable, but because his life revealed how ordinary civilians could become trapped inside decisions made far beyond their control. The historical record preserves those events not to celebrate survival itself, but to remind later generations that nuclear weapons transform ordinary lives in ways that cannot be measured only by military objectives. No civilian should ever be required to endure such an experience. No family should have to depend upon chance for survival in the age of nuclear weapons. And the most enduring legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not the existence of those who survived, but the responsibility shared by later generations to ensure that no one must survive them again.